Followed by Kevin Doogan, who's professor in the School of Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. He writes on the political economy of labor markets and European integration, and he recently published a very popular book that's been used in the classrooms, especially for teaching, but also more widely titled New Capitalism, The Transformation of Work, out by Polity Press.
Hello. I'll start off with an apology. I'm normally better than this. I flew in and then flew out again from Toronto to New York, back to Toronto, and do presentations today. And so if I start,
this is how we do things in Toronto.
If I start kind of rambling, it's not Alzheimer's, it's the effect of jet lag and so forth. The titles, ambivalent. Class struggles and crisis, and how you interpret that. I mean, is the class struggle in crisis, or are we looking at how the crisis affects the class struggle? There are two very different things. I want to talk about the crisis and how it affects the class struggle. And then pose that question and cop out. Because to ask the question how the crisis affects the class struggle, I'm going to come up with well, many people in this room would be old enough to remember Zhou Enlai, the Vietnamese leader. If you haven't heard, ask your grandparents who he was. Vietnamese leader who was asked in the early 70s what is the impact of the French Revolution, to which the answer most people will know, it's too early to tell. In terms of the class struggle, the crisis in the class struggle, it is too early to tell. And I want to try and flesh that out. And I want to talk about the crisis and what is different about this crisis, how it varies from previous periods. And one of the things that to start off with, to try and justify my Zhou Enlai response, is to say the characteristic of this crisis, which marks it different from just about anything else, is that it is a global crisis, but 2 years into the crisis, the rate of recovery across the OECD countries fell off radically. And especially in Europe, 57 months into the recession, the rate of recovery in this crisis in the UK is slower than anything we have seen since the beginning of the 20th century. We're talking about the crisis of after the First World War, the 30s, the crisis of the 1980s and 1990s and so forth. Its recovery is phenomenally slow. And the duration of the crisis helps one of the major characteristics of it. There's another one which we need to talk about, that this is a global crisis, but it has different transmission mechanisms, whether through trade or finance or exposure to the housing market crash, which means it's extraordinarily uneven in terms of how it's experienced, how it's perceived, in terms of economics, in terms of politics. I was in Norway recently, and you talk to people, Norwegians, about the crisis, and I mean, the crisis is not even on the news. It's a somewhat strange obsession with people in the rest of Europe. It doesn't feature in the public consciousness. Well, when unemployment is 3.3% and you've got a fabulous welfare state, it's not surprising that's the case. But compare that, say, with Greece, Spain, Ireland, and so forth. It's a very, very different thing. And I also have spoken in Brazil early on this year, debating about the precariat and so forth with somebody called Guy Standing. And what's interesting about wherever you go, there's a sense of the moods vary as well. And I think the moods, politically, the mood varies from place to place. And I think Jane and I, both coming from Europe, might want to kind of redress the balance of today's discussion, which was perhaps drawing a lot on the North American experience and remembering Gramsci's formulation of the optimism of the will and the pessimism of the intellect, bringing in the European experience of the struggles, which I think is much, much more, well, optimistic in terms of class politics and radical potential. The other thing to say about the crisis is that it has evolved and mutated since it began with Lehman Brothers' collapse. How it's experienced and discussed in 2013 is not how it was discussed in 2008. Nobody mentions anymore subprime mortgages and the kind of disaster of the housing market. Now it's gone on because it's gone from a housing market crisis to an economic crisis to a financial crisis. And importantly, it's further mutated to radically change its character to a sovereign debt crisis. The crisis has gone from private capital to public finance. And what that does is it radically transposes the problematic. The problem to be solved in terms of politics and policy isn't the disaster done to public finances by the bailouts, the disaster of financialization and so forth. The problem to be solved is deficits, fiscal cliffs and so forth. There's a radical transformation of the problem and the solutions. And what's curious about this is that we've gone from a situation in which the banks, the financial institutions, were, not so long ago, they get accused in the dock, and now they're the judges on the bench, presiding over austerity strategies that were brought about in the first place by the kind of bankers' bailouts, solving the kind of gambling debts of financial institutions and so forth. So it's evolved massively in terms of its character, in terms of its sphere of operation, and particularly affecting the public sector. Importantly, it's not confined to jobs. Despite the fact that there's a very long, very slow recovery, a very deep recession, unemployment in the UK is about 7.5%. I mean, I was talking to somebody not so long ago about the labour market consequences of the crisis, and they asked me, if people talk about this crisis being as bad as the 1930s, will it be as bad in terms of labour market? And I said, well, it's a bit like the old joke about, the joke about the surgeon who's telling the recovering patient after the operation, well, we've got some good news for you and we've got some bad news for you. The bad news is we've cut off the wrong legs, and the good news is the other one's getting better. So the bad news, or the good news about this recession, it will not have the same level of unemployment. The 20s and 30% of unemployment. That'll be exceptional, I think, because the impact will be much, much more kind of significantly across public spending. It won't be confined to jobs. It'll be expressed in terms of benefits, pensions, welfare entitlement, public spending, tuition fee hikes, child benefits being slashed, disability pensions and so forth. These are the ways in which this crisis is affecting. And because of that, it is much, much more generalized in its impact. The previous crisis of Fordism was confined and concentrated in terms of large enterprises, large factories, steel mills, pits and so forth. They were the focus of these attacks. Now, if you're going to make cuts, the government has to make them across the board. If you're changing the retirement age up to 66, you do it across the board. If you're changing child benefit, you do it across the board. So there's something about this crisis that generalizes massively in terms of its impact. And that's another different feature of it. The other thing to say about it is we have to understand that if this happens, the politics of it are hugely important. Because the actor in this process of austerity is the government. Now, in the 80s, the government could say, Thatcher and Reagan and all that, could say, let the market rip. There's no demand for steel, there's no demand for coal. They cannot say now, there's no need for education, there's no need for health, there's no need for social services. They can't say that. So they're forced onto another form of legitimacy, which is that the country can't afford it. And once you make those sorts of statements about, which tries to legitimize it in terms of what the country can and can't afford, then you're in a different ballgame which demands a much higher level of politics and political response. Now, one of the ways, and it's shocking, one of the ways in which they seek to legitimize the choices made, because people have to make choices between welfare and warfare, between and public spending priorities, and justify cutbacks on the grounds that the country can't afford it. Now, one of the ways that happens is to say, we want it to be fair. The country can't afford it, the country's all in this together. We will be fair in how we do this. In order to be fair to the taxpayer, we will have to raise the tuition fees of university students. In order to be fair to the next generation, we will have to cut back on public spending for pensions. In order to be fair to the private tenants, we will cut back on housing benefit for those in social housing. I mean, every time the government talks about fairness, you run for cover because you know they're going to come for you. I mean, I think either we abandon the notion of fairness or let's say, let's be fair to the Tory party. Turn it around on them. So we need a higher level of politics to deal with that. Another thing to say about it, I think we also have to recognize if we're looking at austerity and we're looking at how it impacts on the public sector, we're dealing here with a public sector workforce that on the plus side, the good news is high levels of trade union representation. The not so good news is that there's a concern or a reluctance to engage in strike action. You can't imagine nurses donning their aprons and walking out of intensive care units. You can't imagine people who deliver essential social services taking to strike action, ongoing strike action in the same way that manufacturing, metal workers and so forth. So there's a necessity to see how we can, I'm the union rep in my university department, and it's a curious, everybody's a member of the union, and we had a 2-day strike early on, 9 months ago, and there's really amazing debates about what's involved in the strike action. Do you tell your boss that you've been on strike? Do you volunteer to give your 2 days' wages back to the employer? Seriously, that's what was it, and the union line was, you tell your employer you're on strike and you send your wages back. And then the other part of the argument was, well, do we reschedule the work so that the students don't miss out and we can put them on in different places? Now, I mean, imagine a trade union response to austerity which says, right, I'll give you 2 days' wages and I'll do the work anyway. I mean, can you imagine an employer saying, I'll have one of them every week? But yet, and this is the reason why I think in some ways baby steps are involved here. I was speaking in the University of Sao Paulo early on last year, and the University of Sao Paulo workers were involved in a dispute. University admin staff were involved in a dispute about contracts. They were supported by the unions, and they were involved with pitched battles with the army. We're talking about a very, very different politics. 2 minutes. We're talking about but I think if you look at the what has happened thus far will not determine the situation down the line. I'm absolutely convinced that. I'm sure things will go up and down. The balance of class forces will shift. It'll shift to the right and to the left. I think there's a volatility to the period. But I think there's a level of politics needed to kind of understand and underpin the political response that when the government says a pension struggle is purely a defense of privilege, privileged public sector workers, and trying to kind of support a division between them and private sector workers. We need to have the class response which says the defence of privilege was the bankers' bailout. The bankers' bailout, the defence of the elite. So when you talk about the damage done by that, that is why we have the tax and pensions in the first place. We have to talk about, the experience of the crisis, the insanity of capitalist crisis in the present moment of time. One of the things that is not often talked about is housing in the midst of a recession. In Spain, where you've got a housing problem, you have a huge surplus housing stock that, according to some estimates, will take 30 years to clear. That's nothing compared to what the situation in Ireland is, when you've got 20% of the country unable to maintain mortgage payments, who are in arrears. When homelessness is a real problem, you have enormous empty properties. You have ghost estates. And the Deutsche Bank reckon it'll take 43 years for this to clear. So the insanity of capitalism, the insanity of the crisis, the politics of that needs to underpin the resistance. That is why I think it is, if we look at the situation in Europe, we see general strikes in Greece, we see general strikes in Spain, general strikes in this country, but they need to be underpinned, steeled with a politics which says we're not simply about defending pensions, we're defending services, and we are attacking the insanity of a system that has got to this state of affairs because of the bailout of the bankers. Thanks.